Well, greetings, Become More podcast listeners. This is Jeremy Scott, pastor and chief joy officer here at the United Methodist Church of Johnstown. And we're going to get back to doing something that I've always really loved doing, which is these midweek podcast kind of updates or addendums to the sermon from Sunday. And since we're starting a new worship series called Distracted Daily, and we are on Rally Sunday, so we're kind of at the beginning of the program year, this felt like a good time to do that. And also this Sunday is one of those ones that left a lot of stuff that I was pretty excited about that I couldn't get into the sermon. And that happens sometimes, especially when I'm really digging into Scripture and getting ready, or I've got an important theme or whatever it is. There's things that kind of I get excited about that I don't have time or, just can't fit in because it's probably a whole other sermon. So I wanted to take a minute and kind of talk through and expand on a little bit what we talked about on Sunday. So we were looking at the prodigal son on Sunday, which is a kind of famous story in Scripture. It's one of those things, as I mentioned, that stories that people know even if they don't know anything about the Bible. And it's, the story of the guy who, demands his inheritance, goes, squanders it, and then has to kind of come back tail between his legs to his family, hoping that they would take him in at least as a hired hand, because that's better than where he found himself living at the time. And of course, the father embraces him and welcomes him back with open arms. One of the things that we talked about in that story is that the prodigal son is actually the third story in a series of parables that Jesus uses at this part in order to basically address some of the questions that were brought up by the religious leaders of his day. It says, in the Scripture specifically, it says Pharisees and tax collectors. But anytime you hear Pharisee, Sadducee, tax collector, whatever, teachers of the law, all that kind of stuff, you can substitute in religious leaders, because that's who he's talking about. And he's not just talking about religious leaders, but he's talking about religious leaders of his religion, right? So Jesus is a Jew, right? Jesus is an Israelite. He is part of God's people, and he's talking about fellow people of his religious tradition. And I think that's important for us to remember also, too. Anytime we encounter this stuff, he's talking about religious leaders within his own religious tradition. I mean, so in many ways, as for Christians, he's talking about me. Right? I mean, if this was written today and it may be, say, a group of pastors, or theologians or seminary professors or whatever were challenging what Jesus was teaching. And they were challenging him, on what he was doing, especially that he was hanging out with people you shouldn't hang out with and all of that. And so he tells these three stories, and actually he doesn't tell three stories, he tells four. And it's the fourth one I want to talk about in a minute. But just quickly, and I mentioned this on Sunday as well, he tells these three stories. The first two involve a lost sheep and a lost coin. And of course, what's important there is that sheep lose themselves all the time. Sheep are pretty stupid. We shouldn't be surprised that sheep get lost. So you can't really blame the sheep. And of course, coins don't have any sort of, sense of self. They're not animate. They don't do anything other than what we do with them. So, the woman who lost the coin, it's not the coin's fault. The woman lost the coin. And so those ones you're like, okay, yes, of course you rejoice when you recover your lost sheep, or of course you rejoice when you find your lost coin, because it's not the sheep's fault or the coin's fault they got lost. The prodigal son is different, because the prodigal son demand something that he is kind of entitled to. Right? I mean, he is an inheritor of his father's property, and he does stand to inherit at some point in the future, but he demands it now. He wants it early, and really, he wants it before he's really earned it or is ready for it. And of course, we know that because of what he does with it. Right? He doesn't take it and invest it in his future. He doesn't take it in order so that he can, start his own farm or his own business or anything like that. He takes it and he decides to have, a wild few months of high living until it's all gone and he's basically squandered it, and then he, of course, has to go home. And he goes home and he is, of course, welcome back with his amazing open arms. And we also get another little nuance in the story that I really love that we can get a chance to talk about which is the older brother. There's another brother. There's a brother also who's a character in the story. And we stopped reading scripture on Sunday before we got there. And the brother doesn't understand why the father is so excited to welcome the younger brother home. And in fact, he's jealous, right? He's jealous because he never wandered off. He never did anything. He was one of the 99 sheep that stayed where they were supposed to. So why is the dad celebrating and so excited about it? And in fact, so there was a party for, the one that wandered away, who clearly did something wrong and did something inappropriate. The dad has to kind of explain it to him, and he does. Now, I don't want to go far down that path because that's a whole other sermon for a whole other day, and then I will probably get there at some point. In fact, I think I may have even preached a sermon on the older brother here. I don't know, but I want to save that one. What I want to talk about, though, is actually the next story. So Jesus has been talking to, so far, these religious leaders around him. And he does that throughout the chapter 15. And then in chapter 16, quick reminder again, the chapter markers were added later, right? So somebody decided this was the start of a new chapter. But really, it's not, because it's just a continuation of Jesus telling these 4 stories. And so he starts with the sheep, and then he goes to the coin, and then we got the prodigal son, and then he tells this 4th story about a manager. And it does say in chapter 16, verse 1, that Jesus then said to his disciples, so ostensibly before he was talking to the whole group, including these religious leaders, and then he turns to the disciples and he starts talking to the disciples. It becomes clear later that he's still doing so in earshot of everybody else around, right? So he's not really like huddling off into a corner or anything like that. He's just doing that thing where he's been talking to his whole group, and then he turns and he faces, this smaller group of his disciples and starts to talk to them, but in a way that everyone else can hear. And he starts to tell his disciple about a rich man and his manager. And here's the thing, even at the time, people, there were really, really wealthy people. And we talked today about income inequality and things like that. Income inequality is something that's always existed, and in fact, it was as bad, if not worse, in the first century than it is even today. Which means that there were a handful of people who had more wealth and more, stuff and more business and more everything else than they could possibly manage on their own. So they would hire people to manage their money for them, much like rich people do today. They hire accountants and lawyers and all that. Well, they, or if you own a lot of businesses, you may like you own a lot of restaurants or something, you have individual managers at the individual restaurants. So there's a rich man who had a manager who was in charge of some aspect of his business. And the rich man had been told that that person had been squandering his property, meaning that he wasn't managing well the property of the rich man that he was being asked to manage. He wasn't a good manager. He was squandering it, and probably for, his own kind of immediate gain, or just really wasn't paying attention because, maybe didn't feel the same sense of responsibility to it because it actually wasn't his, right? It didn't belong to him, wasn't his thing. So somehow, some way, he wasn't doing a good job, and he wasn't taking proper care of the rich man's possessions and property. And he was squandering it. And that, I think that word squandering is important because it says what he basically was being, inattentive at best, or, actively negligent, at worst. But somehow he was not behaving as he should, and into a way that wasn't really benefiting anybody, right? To squander something, means to allow something to, fall apart or whatever in a way that doesn't benefit anybody, not benefiting the rich man, probably not benefiting the manager, just sort of, being left to get dilapidated or whatever. I mean, whatever word you want to use. So the manager is squandering something from his boss. And so he's summoned in front of the rich man, and he's basically told that he wants an accounting, right? Meaning he wants him to go through and take an accounting of everything that he has been given to manage and what state that it is in. And of course, the manager knows enough to know that this is not going to go well. You think about it as maybe he's like doing an audit, right? Like, and you're going to go through and you're going to check every, that every T is crossed and every I is dotted and that every, ounce of grain is where it's supposed to be. Well, the manager knows that that's not going to go well, right? Like he's been squandering. So he will not be able to adequately account for everything he needs to account for. And he's in trouble, or he's going to be in trouble. And so he knows that he's going to be in trouble. And he has this great line where he says, the manager apparently said to himself, "What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. The manager knows that if he loses his position, he's not going to get another one, right? He's not going to leave this place with a great reference. He's not going to be able to get another position or job as good as the one he got, and he's probably going to be relegated to manual labor or something like that, because that's what there was to choose from. There was no going back to college to get another degree to reinvent myself. It wasn't a thing. So he's like, I don't want to do those things, right? Like I've been in this cushy manager job my whole life. I've been sitting behind a desk. I can't pick up a shovel and dig. I don't want to be like one of those poor people begging on the streets. I'd be ashamed to do that. So he looks around and he looks around and goes, what do I still have access to? And he's like, well, he's still technically the manager, right? He's been asked to give an accounting. He knows how that's going to go, but he's not done it yet, right? He's still technically the manager of whatever's in front of him, which is not his again, but belongs to his owner, his boss. And so he decides to do something rather interesting. He decides to call in to people who owe something, not to him, but to his boss, right? And he decides to curry favor with them so that when he is dismissed, they may have a good feeling about him and they may welcome him into their home. Right? Because somehow losing his job probably means he's going to lose his place to live. He's going to lose his livelihood, and he's going to need somebody to take him in and take care of him and help him get back on his feet. So he decides to take what he has left, which is still this manager role, and use it to get people, to get on the good side of those who owe his manager something. So he calls in these people, and he calls in the first ones, and he says, "How much do you owe my master?" Right? And this is before the days of American Express or things like that. So you would borrow from people. And he says, "I owe him 100 jugs of olive oil," which is a lot. Right? So this guy's clearly some kind of merchant. Somebody borrowed 100 jugs of olive oil ostensibly to sell it somewhere else and then come back and then return and pay for it, basically after the fact, after they had sold it, pay for it with the profits and then keep whatever profits that they make from selling it. And so he said, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. So he basically cuts in half the amount of what he owes back to the master. And then he does this again with another person who apparently owes 100 containers of wheat. And he comes back and he says, "Okay, make it 80. And there's no real rhyme or reason that we're told as to why he's getting, one person gets a 50% discount, one person gets a 20% discount. But he's somehow being being some choosy about who he offers what. And everybody seems really excited about this deal. Like, who wouldn't be excited to find out that their debts had been immediately cut by 20% or 50%? Like, this is great. Everyone's very excited about this. And then his master commended the dishonest manager. And I love that the scripture calls him that. He's called dishonest. He's like, he commends the dishonest manager for acting shrewdly. And it says the children of this age are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than are with the children of light, which is a very awkward sentence and doesn't really actually say much. But then verse 9, "And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes." And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into eternal homes. So we're back. There's a shift here happening. And we once again have Jesus talking, and he's talking to the people around him. He's talking to his disciples ostensibly. And he's basically telling them to make friends. He makes friends, curry favor with folks, and do it, maybe not by whatever means you can, but even by means of dishonest wealth. So we have this weird juxtaposition with these two final stories that Jesus tells. One where we've got the prodigal son who's being celebrated for, taking, not necessarily being celebrated, but you have the prodigal son who takes what he's honestly owed, right? It's not dishonest that he took his inheritance. It's weird that he took it early, but he took what he, honestly was allowed, honestly given, and then squanders it, recognizes that he squanders it, and then goes home again, basically, seeking in some ways, to make it better. And he is not only forgiven, but welcomed back with open arms, even though he squandered what he has been given. And then we get the story of the dishonest manager who is not come by what he has, by honest means. He's called the dishonest manager. This guy is instead celebrated because he took what he gained dishonestly and used it well. So the prodigal took what he was given honestly and used it poorly, and then this guy uses what he got dishonestly, but apparently used it well. And these stories really only make the most sense when you align them together, especially the dishonest manager. Because what we have in here is this progression from the blameless sheep that happened to wander off and the lost coin that was really only could have possibly been lost by the one who found it, right? All the way through to people who are now actually, who are intentional in their action, who are not blameless like the sheep and the coin are, but in fact have blame for what they've done. And both of them, for different reasons in different ways, at the end of the day, end up being celebrated. And they get celebrated because at the end of the day, they do the right thing. And how important it is to do the right thing, no matter how it is that we found ourselves to be in a given place. The most important thing is wherever we find ourselves, do we find a way to do the right thing from that point forward, right? The prodigal son isn't browbeaten and maligned by the father for having squandered what he's been given on a bunch of fanciful living. And the dishonest manager isn't chastised again for being a poor steward, even though he was. None of this condones what happened. And that, I think, is the key to this. The prodigal son is not, his taking and squandering what he's been given is not condoned, right? It doesn't say, oh, actually, that was okay. No, we're in there. It was not okay. It was not okay for him to it wasn't okay for him to demand his inheritance early. It wasn't okay for him to squander it or anything like that. That was not okay. But his decision at the end to come back humbly, to come back, not expecting to receive his high position once again, but willing to accept whatever his dad was able or willing to offer to him, and to be very clear from the beginning that he was contrite, right? That he understood he had done wrong, right? And instead of no longer looking at his immediate gain, right? To no longer look at I just want to have fun. I want to have fun right now. To be willing to take a longer term view of life, all of that. And because of all of that, he says, okay, because you are there now, we are excited you are home, and we are so excited you're home, we're going to throw you a party. And the dishonest manager is a dishonest manager, and he did squander, and he was not particularly apparently good at his job. And that was not a good thing, and nothing in here says that it was. But at the end of the day, he does decide, and it's still kind of a weird thing that happens here. I don't want to take away from that. But he does decide to take what little bit he has remaining, what little bit of authority, a little bit of, responsibility he has left, and instead use it in a long-term way. And that's really the story of both of these things, right? Both the dishonest manager and the prodigal son have the same problem, which is they're looking for immediate gratification. They want what they want, and they want it now. They want fun and games, and they want it now. They want satisfaction now, right? The dishonest manager was too busy doing apparently other things to do a good job, so he was negligent in what he was doing. He squandered what he was given. The prodigal son was actively, pursuing, a more, kind of, I don't know what kind of word you want to use there, but more kind of extravagant lifestyle, just looking to avoid work and responsibilities and just, have a good time with his friends or whatever was going on there, right? And so they were both kind of in that same vein. They were looking right now, where we are, right? How do I have the most fun right now? The future be darned. And they are rewarded when they come to their senses and realize that that's maybe not what to do. Maybe that's not the way that we are supposed to live. And so what I think is important about this, especially about the story of the dishonest manager, is while it does not condone necessarily his actions before, that line about the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And I tell you, make friends with yourself by the means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into eternal homes. Make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth. This is kind of a hard one to wrap our brains around, because obviously God would prefer we made our wealth honestly. And I don't think God's against making money by any means. Some people seem really good at it, right? I don't think that necessarily is the problem. But I think what we're saying here is, however it is you happen to have come by whatever you are coming by, whatever it is, whatever resources or you happen to have access to, by whatever means things have come into your life, whether they be one way or another, you will always have the opportunity to think about and figure out, how do I take what I have and use it in the best way possible? How do I take what I have, however it is I happen to have come by it, and use it in the best way possible? Because while the dishonest manager was dishonest, nothing he's done is technically illegal, right? It's not quite like that. It's that he has been selfish before. He has been self-centered before. And because he was that way, he happens to have accumulated around him some amount of authority, some amount of opportunity. And so the question then becomes, what do you do with it? And how do you take that to use it in the best way possible? And we've seen this throughout history, right, where, rich people, especially rich people, but if you look at, I remember growing up and my library growing up was a Carnegie library. And while Carnegie, spent most of his, adult life accumulating wealth, he spent the last part of it giving it away. And one of the ways that he did was to, build all these libraries everywhere. And in many ways, that's what Carnegie is most known for, despite the fact that there are many people who would probably label him as a dishonest manager, to say the least, at the time during his years when he was accruing what he did. And there's a great debate about how much we should celebrate Carnegie for the libraries, because there's so many people, who would say, hey, the way that he went about making that money in the first place wasn't particularly wonderful, and it hurt a lot of people. And one thing I like about this story is we get to see that more pragmatic side of Jesus. And we don't often think about Jesus and religion all that kind of way in more pragmatic terms. But this is one of those examples of stories where Jesus is very willing to think about things in a pragmatic way. And I often, say, well, we can judge how we want, and we should probably take a critical eye and think, how is it good that people come to be in the positions they are in, whether it be due to wealth, or power or whatever it is. Like, that should be a concern for us. But ultimately, what also should be concerned is like, okay, but what are you going to do with it? Right? I mean, would you rather he not had built libraries? I mean, isn't that a good thing to have done? And I would say, as a child who benefited from that generosity, it was. And we can debate how he got there and whether he could have done it differently or could have done it better. I'm sure he can. We all could. But if we were going to say somehow, he, because of how it came, or because how we got to where we are, we don't want, we don't want this or we don't want that. I don't think that's where we're at. So, kind of wrapping up here. I mean, this is one of those weird stories, and I don't know that the Shrewd Manager is one of those stories that's ever really actually going to make sense. And it's one of those we're always going to wrestle with. But if we want to have a clearer look in it, we have to put it in context, not only of its time, but context of the stories around it. Right? Because what we have is, and that's really the most important thing I wanted to mention here, is Scripture does this a lot, where we move from a simpler theme to a more complicated one. So we have some simpler, kind of very, very black and white kind of stories with the coin and the sheep that are fairly straightforward and very obvious. And then we get into much, much more shades of gray with the prodigal son and the shrewd manager. And Jesus is not only not hiding from that gray, he's actually inventing it. Both these are invented stories, right? He doesn't know an actual prodigal son. He doesn't know an actual shrewd manager, right? These are parables. These are stories that Jesus is making up, maybe on the spot. And so he's making up a story with a lot of gray in it. And so he's not only running away, he's not only not running away from the gray, he's embracing it. And he's challenging us through it, to wrestle, with that and to say, I'm not sure I agree with Jesus on this one. I'm not sure I agree that the shrewd manager acted wisely. I don't know that I am very sympathetic to the older brother in the story of the prodigal son, right? So Jesus is willing to go straight into those areas, and I love that about him, and I love that about stories like this, because we can't escape the gray. It's not that simple. I've never lost a sheep because I've never had a sheep to lose, right? I've lost money, lost a $20 bill in the couch cushion, and I definitely was excited when I found it, right? But those kinds of things are far more infrequent in my life than these gray areas where you have to say, this isn't perfectly 100% clear. This isn't black and white. What is it that I'm supposed to do? And in both of these stories, we have the same answer, is you're supposed to do the most good you can with whatever position you happen to find yourself in. And that's what we are called to do. So we need to take that moment when it is offered to us. We need to take the opportunity when it's offered to us. To do good is to think, what is the most good I can do at this time? And if we do that, however it is we got to where we are today, if we do that, then we are following in the path, and we are following in the way that Jesus wants us to. All right. Well, this is a little bit longer than maybe I thought it was going to go, but that's all right. I hope you enjoy. I love these opportunities to do midweek kind of check-ins or expansions, on the sermons. It's not maybe something that we're going to be able to do every week, but it's definitely want to do more of. And this really kind of kicks off, hopefully, what is going to be several different opportunities throughout the week to engage into some more devotional kind of content. This kind of stuff is designed, maybe you listen to it while you're driving or, doing the dishes or, whatever, however you want to come to it, that's fine. But definitely want to give you an opportunity to kind of think and engage in your faith in these kind of deeper questions, not just on Sunday mornings, but, throughout the week. So thank you for joining us and being part of this. You can always check us out on johnstown.church is our website. Of course, Become More is our app. We got the podcast feed going on. We got an app for Apple TV, and I think there's one on Apple or Fire TV now. All the things. So thank you for joining us, and until I see you again, have a great day.